My name is Ian Brennan. I'm from University of Hull. I'm here to talk about Domestic Abuse Matters. It's a training that's been rolled out to first responders in the last couple of years. Large amounts of first responders in different forces across the UK. I'm talking about the evaluation of it, but I'm also, partly because I'm slightly embarrassed about the quality of the evaluation in terms of its internal validity. It's a simple pre-post uncontrolled study in the presence of lots and lots of RCTs. It's quite difficult to sort of really hold up and shout from the rooftops about a sort of pre-post uncontrolled study. So what I'm going to talk about is the process of the evaluation, particularly the evaluation of training to do with coercive control, and some of the pitfalls that we experienced in doing that. There are a number of issues that we came up against in terms of what attitudes we think officers should actually have. So in order to evaluate the training, we had to determine what direction these changes and these attitudes should change in. And that was not as straightforward as I thought. One of the things we came across, to preempt what I'm going to talk about, is lack of consensus even among the trainers who are running these running these events. They often disagreed about what direction of change attitudes should go in. And I found that sort of astonishing to some extent, that these people are all delivering the same training yet don't have a consensus about what attitudes should be changed by the training. I am going to have some audience participation in this. I brought my clickers along. I use these in teaching. They're brilliant, for getting sort of student involvement. But they don't work here for some reason. So it's that old actor adage, never work with animals, children, or licensed polling software. So I'm just going to get you to either stick your hands up or stand up later on. So there's only a few questions, but it might get the blood flowing as well in the last session. Okay. Right, so Domestic Abuse Matters. This is a training program that's been rolled out to first responders across a number of different forces. I'm going to talk about the evaluations in Humberside and Suffolk, but it's continuing to be rolled out across different forces. Every couple of months there seems to be a new force implementing it. So this is a training program that is designed to change and improve first responder attitudes towards victims, change in particular their attitudes towards coercive and their knowledge about coercive and controlling behaviour. This is the second iteration of this program. It was trialled in 2015, and the first RCT evaluation of that came out in 2016. We, in this next iteration of it, took some of the lessons from the previous trial, tried to change it, and we also changed the evaluation, albeit with absolutely no money. So the goal of the training is to improve responsiveness to domestic abuse cases, particularly coercive controlling behaviour. There's a really strong rationale for the need for this training. The HMIC report that has been mentioned several times already emphasised how difficult it is to identify coercive and controlling behaviour, particularly in the absence of, or the comorbidity of physical abuse. The DASH and other forms of risk assessment are very much incident physical violence focused. We all know that, we've heard it so many times. But also new research that my research team has undertaken, but also Andy Myhill has discussed in the past, is that there are increased opportunities for discretion and cuffing, effectively, and ignoring controlling coercive behaviour. Discretion isn't necessarily a problem unless you're stretched for resources, and thank God that isn't the case in the police force. So it's something I think we need to address. That coercive and controlling behaviour is actually easier to hide. It requires more effort and insight to uncover, and that's something that really does need to be researched in considerably more detail. The potential for these cases just to be ignored because of the resources they will require. What also, as something I was thinking about earlier, is that there is a need for some evaluation of the costs of investigating coercive control and a comparison of that against physical, and maybe changing the budgeting that accommodates the capacity to investigate these. I'm not familiar with any cost evaluations, but I would like to see them. Okay, so the objectives of the training were to understand the dynamics of domestic abuse, understand the reality of domestic abuse, and respond effectively to reports of domestic abuse. Three main overarching goals. Strong emphasis on identification and understanding of coercive and controlling behaviours, and particularly of particularly of victims' behaviours. So a sort of general, in the first set of sort of first objective, a general understanding of domestic abuse, but also trying to understand the decision-making, often apparently ambiguous and inconsistent decision-making on the part of victims, and also the ambiguous and confusing behaviour on the part of perpetrators. So the training is trying to sort of inform officers and first responders about the sort of, based on the knowledge we have about these sort of tactics and behaviours. So it was a one-day mandatory training. It's classroom-based. It was a combination of lectures, but also videos, sometimes very harrowing videos, critical reflection and discussion. This was an advance on the earlier iteration of the programme, which tended to be more lecture-focused, had less opportunity for discussion and insight. So it was good to see that was, you know, the lessons from that first evaluation were taken on board and implemented and changed. But we need to remember it is a one-day mandatory classroom-based training. Mandatory, I don't necessarily think is the most conducive way to changing attitudes. But this was the rationale for this was to try and hit a critical mass of people with sort of short-term attitude change program. So, and they were certainly effective in hitting a critical mass. I think the aim was to have 90% of first responders trained within 5 training days in Humberside, and something quite similar in Suffolk. So they really put a lot of resources into this, and there was a lot of buy-in from the force. The training, as I said, was sort of classroom based. Is up to 25 participants, or 25 trainees per classroom. And it was successful in hitting that sort of, it got about 85% of the first responders that it expected to. So in terms of delivery, it was certainly a success in both Humberside and Suffolk. So as I said, this is the second iteration of the Domestic Abuse Matters training. It was evaluated in 2015 and published in 2016 using an RCT evaluation. So much more rigorous than the evaluation that I'm talking about. There was a sample of 400 in that. What's really interesting is it found very little change. There's a surprisingly little impact on attitudes towards domestic violence or domestic abuse. Very little change in understanding of victims' engagement or non-engagement, or that sort of ambiguous, often contradictory sort of behaviour. I think that should set alarm bells ringing. This is training that was evaluated immediately before, very soon before the training, and then about the post follow-up evaluation was taken very soon afterwards. For that not to have had an impact on attitudes seems to me very strange. Even the socially desirable aspect of it, the sort of enthusiasm bump that you should get from training, didn't seem to be there. As a psychologist, I'm aware how easy, and everybody's aware, how easy it is to change attitudes. It's changing those attitudes into behaviour, and long-term behaviour change is the problem. I found this really strange, and this is one of the things I want to talk about, is the problems in designing evaluation of this sort of training. Look, there was change in terms of knowledge, which is an important thing to note. There was improved knowledge of coercive control, and there was a small positive change in understanding of victims' reasons for not leaving. Okay, so that's the first iteration. This is our second iteration. Focused on attitude change across 3 domains. General attitudes towards domestic abuse. So that first set of evaluation questions focused on myths and sort of support for domestic abuse myths, but also the discounting of severity in terms of coercive control, and whether officers thought that non-physical abuse was less serious than physical abuse. And also focus on rationalizing victim behavior, and this is, I'm using rationalizing in a bad sense here. The attempt to see victim behavior through a rational lens and then to interpret behavior as, for example, not leaving through that rational lens based on a very limited amount of information. That's not a good way to try and think about victim behavior. So the training attempted to remove that tendency towards rationalizing this behavior. So we designed a series of questions based around those three sections. We generated 35 items, so it's about 11 or 12 per each of those sections. And that was between myself and Andy Myhill, and we used some of the questions that have been included in the earlier initiative. We were conscious that we're not trainers. We're sort of looking at the evidence from a somewhat impartial perspective, but we had ideas about which direction of change we wanted to see attitudes go. Did we want a particular attitude to increase or to decrease? But we said we'd send that to the trainers and see if they agreed, and this is where things got slightly interesting. We initially assumed that we would have a very high consensus, that there would be a question, something about a victim behavior, and almost all trainers would agree in this attitude should increase or this attitude should decrease if the training was successful. So we set an initial threshold at about 90% agreement or inter-rated reliability. What we started to see very quickly was that there was a lot of people who reported, and this is a small sample, this is 20% of all the trainers, it's only 8 people. A lot of people felt the questions, they couldn't decide. The questions were ambiguous, not because they were poorly worded, because there was a poorly worded option as well, but ambiguous because they couldn't decide what should an attitude change be. And even more importantly, 20% of trainers, or in 20% of items, trainers actually said that they should go in different directions. So one trainer said, yes, that attitude should definitely increase if the training worked, and another said, no, that attitude should definitely decrease if the training worked. That should set alarm bells ringing as well about the complexity of this sort of understanding this behaviour, the complexity of developing training based on that. So this is just sort of the series of questions that we had. So that's, I think it's about 35 items. We had a cut-off point around 70% agreement. So these are the ones that we included here. But you can start to see even some of these were just poorly written on our part. But not great consensus among the people who are training about what should happen. Okay, so in terms of just effectiveness, there was a simple pre and post design. We measured people's attitudes before the training, 5 minutes before the training started, and we measured them 5 minutes afterwards. As I said before, you should see a big bump just because of the enthusiasm of being in the room. We didn't have a control group because we couldn't afford one. And there was a focus on attitudes and risks, as I've talked about before. One of the secondary aims that we tried to include was to try and figure out why didn't domestic abuse 1 work, and why didn't the evaluation at least show effectiveness. So the training was evaluated in Humberside and Suffolk in spring and summer 2016 with a massive sample size of 1,551, and we assessed change using linear regression. One thing that you have to be really careful about with a sample size that large is basically just someone farting just before the post-evaluation happens will give you a significant effect. Like, it's really easy to change, to get statistical significance in a sample size that large, particularly when it's repeated measures. So what I wanted to focus on was effect size rather than statistical significance. What we found basically was there was very small changes. The changes tended to be in the right direction, but they were really, really small, sort of 10% of a standard deviation. And yeah, they were statistically significant but minor. One of the important things to note is that we actually had very high baselines for a number of these items. So the average score on the pre-measures were often out of 5, some of them were like 4.1, 4.2. So you had this strong potential for a ceiling effect and regression to the mean. But that wasn't the case with all of them. It was the case with about 25% of them. So we have very small effect sizes for many of these items. But there was statistical difference between Humberside and Suffolk, which is something that we need to investigate. We haven't finished analysing that yet. In terms of risk and risk assessment of coercive control, they were fairly consistent across the forces, but general attitudes towards domestic abuse didn't move that much in Suffolk, whereas they did in Humberside. Watch this space for evaluation of that. Okay, so as I said, one of the the aims of this talk is not to discuss or present the results, but to figure out what goes on, or what do people think attitude, or how attitudes should shift following this training. So I want to do a little bit of an experiment. Now, if I had my clickers, this would work great, but you're just going to have to stick your hands up. I want you to imagine that you have designed a coercive control training program for your colleagues and staff. There is a series of things that you want to achieve. You want better attitudes towards victims. You want them to focus on risk factors for future harm and victimization that are coercive and controlling as much as they are physical. I would just like you to put up your hands to tell me which direction you think this, the relevance of this particular item should be in predicting future victimization. So the victim reports that the abuser tracks their phone. Should that become more or less relevant after a training on coercive control that focuses on coercive control? Who says the relevance should decrease? Does anybody say it should stay the same? It's not important. Anyone for an increase? All right. Good. How about the victim has no friends to stay with? Should that be decreasing in relevance, staying the same, or increasing? So who says decrease? Does anyone say it should stay the same? It's not important. Who thinks it should increase? Okay. To what extent do you agree with the following statement about why victims do not leave abusive relationships? They would fear for their safety. Should that decrease, stay the same, or increase? Increase. Okay, excellent. Those are the ones that all the trainers agreed on, so at least we're on the same page. How about these ones? So, to what extent would you agree with the following statement? It's hard to see why victims of domestic abuse don't just leave. Who thinks that somebody who's undertaken coercive control training and victim awareness training, that should decrease in their agreement? Seeing a few nods. Who thinks that shouldn't really change? Does anyone think it should increase in agreement? This is one of the ones that the trainers could not agree on. Perhaps there's some ambiguity in the language, but this sort of emphasizes some of the difficulties. How about this one? In terms of predicting future victimization, there has been physical violence. Should that have increased, or should that have decreased relevance? Stay the same, increased relevance. Okay, we're starting to see a lack of consensus in the room. Things are working. The house is well presented. Should that decrease in agreement, stay the same, increase in agreement? Okay, this is one of the central. It's not one of the central, but this item is featured in domestic abuse in domestic abuse matters training. Now, I presented it out of context, but there was inconsistency and lack of consensus. But that statement is in the training. So, what I'm trying to get at, and I won't. I think we're running out of time, so I'm going to push forward. That's an interesting one. What do you think about this one? If the victim is willing to make a statement, to what extent do you agree with the following? In terms of predicting, the victim is willing to make a statement. Should there be decreased relevance? Not important. So no change. Increased relevance. Okay. Again, considerable lack of consensus on the part of the trainers in this. I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to push forwards. I think measuring attitude change in this is way more complicated than we actually envisaged in the first place, and I think the evaluation that we've done failed to understand the complexity and the complexity in the training, but also the complexity of coercive control, signals of abuse as incidents, unpredictable victim behaviour. We're aware of it, but I think we actually considerably underestimated in terms of developing an evaluation. The lack of consensus in terms of what constitutes a risk factor for future coercive control, as evidenced by your responses in the room, as evidenced by the trainers, does not bode well for any predictive or actuarial risk assessment on coercive control. We really do need to nail down these risk factors a lot better than what we've been able to so far. Okay, so, right, last question. If we don't want to focus on attitudes, so let's just assume temporarily that we don't think attitudes is, we can't really measure attitudes effectively or efficiently at this stage. What should be the priority in the short term? What should our target or goal be in terms of policing coercive control? What benchmark should we use to say, yes, we have been successful, either in evaluating training or evaluating new initiatives? So this is one you can actually answer, you can put up your hand for as many of these as you want, but I'll just go through them one after the other. If you think this is a worthwhile, useful target, just put up your hand. So, should we continue to look for positive attitudinal change in first responders? Yeah. Increased prosecution, should that be the benchmark? Yeah. Okay. If you're just going to say yes to everything, aren't you? Is there anything in there that is not feasible, or is there anything that we should that should be prioritised? So, is there anything that? All right, actually, I'll go through the 9 of them or 10 of them, and you say which one you think is the most important, the most valuable for the short term, the next couple of years, in terms of assessing how well we're doing coercive control. Stick up your hand. Choose the one you like. And stick up your hand if you agree that a positive attitudinal change should be the primary thing that we focus on for the next couple of years. Increased prosecutions. Should that be the benchmark, the threshold for success? Increased convictions. Increased community awareness. Increased perpetrator awareness, so awareness of the things that the perpetrator, are doing. Increased victim awareness, the victim's recognition that they are being controlled. Okay. Increased reporting. It's a killer, the reporting. Improved assessment of risk. Should we set that? Okay, so a nice broad and other. Does anyone have? Okay, but the questions at the end will leave for that. Interested is a sort of broad range of opinions. I'll try and write some of this up as sort of as ideas for the future. Okay, so most of the things that we've talked about are we should set as benchmarks, I think, are behavioural rather than attitudinal. We have real problems in determining how successful we are because we have low reporting rates. We don't have a threshold. We don't have a benchmark for how much coercive control is actually happening. So we have nothing to sort of gauge our success against. Maybe we need to try and identify some sort of benchmarks in that regard. Just in terms of just looking at the training and domestic abuse matters, training aims to reach a critical mass will always be superficial, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will be ineffective. Maybe if you train 85% of those people and 10% of them actually take it on board, they can make the difference. The 90% is arbitrary, I think. Perhaps officer attitudes may not actually be the greatest impediment to successful policing domestic abuse. We need to have a system of hard and soft incentives that raises the profile of domestic abuse within policing and raises the rewards for doing good jobs in those in that field. Apologise for running over. Thanks very much for participating. Thanks for listening.